Everyone sells eventually. The only question is how much pain it takes before they do. He said it like a man who had broken people before, like he enjoyed it. Madison Carter stood in the wreckage of everything her father ever built, shattered glass, destroyed equipment, customer vehicles torn apart, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not grief, not fear, something colder, something that said not this time. If this story hits something real inside you, subscribe to this channel, drop your city in the comments, and stay until the very last word. Let's find out how far this story can travel. Madison Carter had been waking up before sunrise since she was 12 years old. Back then, she used to wake up early because her father needed help. He would already be in the garage by 4:30 in the morning, moving around in the dark, organizing tools that didn't need organizing, checking on cars that he had already checked on the night before. Her father, Robert Carter, was not the kind of man who could stay still. He was the kind of man who believed that if your hands weren't working, your mind was worrying. And worrying, he always said, was just fear wearing a suit. So he worked instead, and Madison worked beside him. By the time she was 15, she could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone. By the time she was 18, she had rebuilt a 1969 Chevy Camaro from almost nothing, piece by piece, weekend after weekend, until it ran smoother than the day it rolled off the factory floor. Her father had stood back and looked at that car with his hands on his hips and that quiet expression he reserved for moments that mattered. And he said, "You didn't just fix that car, Maddie, you understood it." She didn't know what he meant then. She understood it now. Carter's Classic Auto Repair sat on the edge of Silver Creek, Colorado population. Just under 8,000 people, the kind of town where everybody knew your name, and a few people knew your business a little too well. The garage had a wooden sign above the entrance that Robert Carter had painted himself the year he opened it. The letters were slightly uneven because he had done it freehand, and Madison had once offered to have it repainted properly, and he had looked at her like she had suggested tearing down the whole building. "Imperfect things have a story," he said. "Perfect things are just expensive." That sign was still hanging there on the morning Madison turned 29. Robert Carter had been gone for 3 years by then, a heart attack sudden and without warning, the kind that doesn't give a man time to say the things he still needed to say. Madison had been in the middle of an oil change when her phone rang, and by the time she drove to the hospital, she was already too late. She stood in that hospital hallway for a long time before she cried, and when she finally did cry, she cried not for what she had lost, but for what she hadn't known she still needed. There were so many questions she had never asked him, so many stories she had assumed she still had time to hear. The garage went to her in the will. Everything else was simple. The garage was the only thing that mattered anyway. She had thought about selling it. Not seriously, just in the way you think about things at 3 in the morning when grief has made you practical and numb. But every time the thought surfaced, something inside her pushed back. This was the place where she had learned to work, where she had learned to listen, where she had learned that people trusted you not because of what you said, but because of what you did day after day without anyone watching. So she stayed. She painted the walls herself. She bought new equipment with money she didn't really have. She kept her father's pricing structure, which meant she charged people what the work was worth rather than what the market could bear, which also meant she wasn't getting rich, but she was sleeping fine at night. Silver Creek trusted her. Not because she was Robert Carter's daughter. Not at first anyway. They trusted her because she showed up. Because she was honest when something was wrong and honest when something could wait. Because she didn't talk down to people who didn't know cars, and she didn't overcharge people who did. Because when old Mrs. Hendricks brought in her 2003 Ford Taurus with a transmission problem that would have cost more to fix than the car was worth, Madison sat down with her and explained exactly what was happening and told her the truth about what made sense financially, even though the honest answer meant less money in Madison's pocket. That was how Robert Carter had done it. That was how Carter's Classic Auto Repair had survived for 22 years in a town that had watched 2 other garages close. So when everything fell apart, it didn't fall apart because Madison had done something wrong. It fell apart because she owned something someone else wanted. The first time she saw Victor Hayes, she didn't know who he was. She was underneath a Dodge Ram pickup working on a brake line when she heard footsteps on the garage floor. Not the shuffling footsteps of a customer who wasn't sure they were in the right place. Purposeful footsteps. The kind that belonged to someone who had already decided the outcome of whatever conversation was about to happen. She rolled out from under the truck and stood up, wiping her hands on her work cloth. He was maybe 50, maybe a little older, Expensive clothes, the kind that were designed to look casual but weren't. Salt and pepper hair, clean and styled. He had the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and had moved into something more calculating with age. He stood in the center of her garage like he was already measuring the space for something else. Two men stood behind him. They didn't look like assistants. Madison Carterman, he said. That's me, she said. Victor Hayes, he didn't offer his hand. Hayes Development Group. She had heard the name. Most people in Silver Creek had by that point. Victor Hayes had been buying up commercial property across northern Colorado for the past 2 years. A strip mall in Pueblo. A shopping center outside Denver. There had been articles in the regional business press about his plans for expansion. The kind of articles that used words like revitalization and economic development and never quite mentioned the people who had to move to make room for the revitalization. What can I do for you, she said. I'm going to be straightforward with you, he said, which was the thing people said right before they weren't. This property is in an excellent location. The commercial corridor on this stretch of highway is going to develop significantly over the next 5 years. I'd like to make you an offer for the building and the land. Madison looked at him. Then she looked at the two men behind him. Then she looked back at him. It's not for sale, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Just slightly, the way a thermostat adjusts when the temperature drops. I haven't told you the number yet, he said. Doesn't matter, she said. This is my father's garage. It's not for sale. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Everything has a price, Miss Carter. I find it's usually just a question of what it takes to get someone to the conversation. He looked around the garage again. Think about it. I'll be back. He left without waiting for her response. His men followed him out. Madison stood in the middle of the garage, hands on her work cloth, and listened to the car pull away. She didn't think about it much after that. Not right away. People had approached her about the property before, mostly commercial real estate agents, and she had said no, and they had moved on. That was how it usually worked. You said no, and people accepted it because in the normal world, no was a complete answer. She didn't know yet that Victor Hayes did not operate in the normal world. She didn't know yet that for him, no was just the beginning of the negotiation. She noticed it 2 weeks later. Her parts supplier, a company she had worked with for 4 years, called to tell her that her account had been flagged for review and that all deliveries were suspended pending an audit. An audit, she said. Why, I've never been late on a payment. I understand, Miss Carter. It's a routine review. It could take 2 to 3 weeks. I have cars on my floor right now that I need parts for. I understand. We apologize for the inconvenience. She hung up and tried her secondary supplier. They told her their warehouse near Silver Creek was temporarily out of her most common inventory items. She tried a third supplier. They said they could help her, but their delivery time to her area had recently extended to 3 to 4 weeks. She frowned at her phone, so it was odd. All 3 in the same week, probably a coincidence. She found parts through a regional contact, paid extra for rush delivery, and got the cars out on schedule. The following Monday, 2 of her oldest customers called to cancel standing appointments they had kept for years. No real explanation, just that they were trying somewhere new. One of them sounded uncomfortable, like he was reading from something. She shook it off. People changed routines. But then the bank called. Her business account, the same account she had held for 6 years without a single issue, had been flagged for a compliance review. No specifics, just that there were questions about recent transaction patterns. Could she come in and speak with someone? She went in on a Wednesday morning. The meeting lasted 45 minutes and accomplished nothing. The bank officer was polite and evasive and told her the review would take some time and that her account would remain in good standing in the meantime. When she asked what had triggered the review, he looked at his screen and then looked at her and said, I'm not able to provide that specific information. She drove back to the garage with a slow, cold feeling beginning to move through her chest. Something was happening. It wasn't random. The parts suppliers, the customers, the bank. 3 different pressure points all pressing at the same time, all within the same 2-week window after Victor Hayes walked into her garage and told her everything had a price. She sat in her father's old office chair and looked at the walls where his photograph still hung. Old cars, old customers. 2 generations of people whose trucks and sedans and motorcycles had been through that garage. What do I do? She said to no one. The photographs didn't answer. But the thing her father had told her 100 times did rise up clear and steady. You keep working, no matter what. You keep working. So she did. The night everything changed, she was alone in the garage until almost 10. She had been trying to get ahead on a backlog that was building because of the parts delays. There was a 1987 Ford F-150 restoration that a customer had been patient about for longer than he should have had to be. She was determined to have it done by the end of the week. She had just turned off the air compressor and was walking toward the back to lock up when she heard something. The front door. She stopped. The door was locked. She had locked it herself at 7. She had checked it twice. The sound came again. Not knocking, not the jiggle of someone checking the handle. The sound of the lock giving way. She stepped back toward the workbench, reached for her phone. 3 men came through the front door, then 2 more through the side entrance. The one who came through the front first looked at her with an expression that had no anger in it, no emotion at all, which was somehow worse than anger. "Ms. Carter," he said, "don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." "Get out of my garage," she said. She had the phone in her hand. She started to dial. The man shook his head slightly. "We just need 5 minutes, then we'll leave." She backed against the workbench. She kept dialing. The call connected and she said the address and she said break in, and she kept her voice steady because falling apart wouldn't help anyone. The man looked at the other 4 men and nodded, and then they went to work. What happened in the next 5 minutes was systematic, methodical. It was not the destruction of vandals who wanted chaos. It was the destruction of people who wanted a message delivered clearly. The diagnostic equipment came down. The floor jacks were disabled. The tool cabinets were overturned. Customer vehicles were damaged in targeted ways, not destroyed, just violated. Enough to create liability. Enough to create panic. She stood with her back against the wall and watched it happen and couldn't stop it because the choice was between her body and her garage, and the cold calculating part of her brain understood that a body was harder to replace. When they finished, the man who had spoken to her walked to the door and turned back. He looked at her with that same flat expression. "Mr. Hayes asked me to tell you that this is a courtesy," he said. "He hopes it helps clarify his interest in working with you." And then they were gone. She stood in the wreckage for a long moment. Then she sat down on the floor, not because her legs gave out, because sitting felt like the only honest response to what had just happened. The police arrived in 12 minutes. She had already called 3 times. Detective Ryan Mitchell was not what she expected. She had expected someone brisk and procedural, someone who would take her statement and file it and tell her they would look into it and mean about 40% of that. What she got instead was a man in his mid-40s who came and looked around the garage for 2 full minutes without saying anything, and then sat down across from her with a notepad and looked at her with an expression that said he understood the weight of what he was looking at. "Tell me everything," he said. "Start with Hayes." She did. She told him about the first visit, the offer, the refusal, the parts suppliers, the bank, the customers who had canceled, and then the 5 men and the 5 minutes and the methodical way they had turned her father's work into rubble. Mitchell wrote steadily. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he looked at his notes and then back at her. "You said Hayes told you everything has a price," he said. His words. "Exactly. And his men told you this was a courtesy." Verbatim. Mitchell sat back. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. "I've seen this before," he said quietly. Then more carefully, not Victor Hayes specifically, but this approach, this pattern. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means this isn't the first time something like this has happened somewhere in this region. There are cases not fully connected yet, not officially, but there are cases." He paused. "I want to be honest with you, Miss Carter. Building a case against someone like Hayes takes time. He doesn't leave obvious fingerprints. Everything comes through intermediaries. The men who came here tonight, do you recognize any of them?" "No. They probably don't have a direct connection to Hayes on paper." He looked at her steadily, "Which means right now, tonight, we can document the break-in and the damage. But connecting it to Hayes is a longer road. So what do I do in the meantime?" Mitchell met her eyes. "You stay open," he said. "You keep the lights on. Because the moment you close, you give him exactly what he wants." She looked at the overturned tool cabinets, the shattered diagnostic screen, the customer vehicles with their deflated tires and cracked windshields. "I don't have equipment," she said. "Then you get equipment. I don't have money to replace what they just destroyed. Then you find another way." He stood. He picked up his notepad. "I know that's not what you want to hear right now." "No," she said, "it really isn't." He paused at the door. Miss Carter, what they did tonight wasn't random. It was targeted. That means they want you afraid. The best thing you can do right now, the most effective thing, is to not be. He left. She sat in the wreckage of her father's garage until 2 in the morning, and then she stood up. She picked up the first overturned tool cabinet herself, because her father's voice was somewhere in the back of her skull, and it was saying the same thing it had always said: you keep working, no matter what. Pattern. The next morning she opened at 6. There were no customers. She spent the morning cleaning the garage by herself, writing what she could write, salvaging what could be salvaged. She worked in silence. Her hands were scraped and her back ached from sleeping in the office chair for 2 hours before dawn, but the work felt important. Not because it fixed everything, because it said something to anyone who was watching. I'm still here. She called 3 regular customers to explain what had happened and apologize for any inconvenience to their vehicles. 2 of them were sympathetic and said they would wait. The third, a man named Dale, who had brought his truck to her father for 15 years, said something that she turned over in her mind for the rest of the day. He said, Maddie, I got a call yesterday morning. Someone told me you were having money problems and that the garage might be shutting down. I didn't know whether to believe it or not. She went very still. Who called you? She said. I didn't recognize the number, he said. When I called it back, it was disconnected. She thanked him and hung up. So it wasn't just physical. They were calling her customers, spreading stories, creating the narrative that Carter's Classic Auto Repair was already dying, so that when it did die, it would look inevitable rather than deliberate. Victor Hayes wasn't just pressuring her. He was building a version of events where she had failed on her own. The cold feeling in her chest got colder. She went back to work. But that evening, she sat in the office and looked at the numbers, and for the first time since her father died, she allowed herself to understand the shape of the things she was facing. The parts delays cost her time and money she didn't have. The bank review meant she couldn't access emergency funds. The customer cancellations and the rumor campaign meant her income was being strangled at the source. And the damaged customer vehicles meant potential liability claims that could accelerate every other problem. She had maybe 6 weeks before the math became impossible. 6 weeks before she would have no choice but to sell. She put her head in her hands. She sat there in the dark of her father's office in the chair her father had sat in for 22 years, and she did something she hadn't done since the night he died. She cried, not because she was giving up, because she needed to feel the full weight of it before she could decide how to carry it. She allowed herself 20 minutes. Then she wiped her face, turned on the light, and started making calls. She called every supplier she had ever worked with. She called former customers she hadn't spoken to in years. She called the Chamber of Commerce and the local paper and her insurance company and every person whose number was in her father's old contacts book. She worked the phone the way she worked on engines, methodically, persistently, without expecting any single call to solve everything. Most of them were sympathetic. A few were more than sympathetic. The local paper agreed to run a piece about the garage's history and what had happened. 2 former customers showed up the next morning and helped her move equipment. A retired mechanic named Frank, who had worked briefly for her father years ago, came in and offered 3 weeks of his time free of charge while she got back on her feet. Your dad gave me a job when I needed one, Frank said simply. Consider this return. It was enough to keep her functional. Barely, but Hayes wasn't finished. The next week, a county zoning officer appeared and informed her that her garage was being reviewed for a potential code violation related to fluid disposal practices. She had never had a violation. Her disposal records were meticulous. But the review required an inspection that took 2 days and generated paperwork that occupied another day, all time she couldn't afford. The week after that, a local news website, not the established paper, but one of the newer sites that had appeared in the last year, published an article claiming that Carter's Classic Auto Repair had been cited for overcharging elderly customers. The article was vague and sourced only to anonymous complaints. There were no names, no specifics, just the allegation and the implication. She demanded a retraction. The site's editor, a man she had never met, told her that the article was based on information received from multiple independent sources and that he stood by it. She pulled the article up on her phone and read it again and understood something she had not fully understood before. Victor Hayes was not just wealthy. He was organized. He had thought this through. He had resources she could not match and patience she could not outlast, and he was using both of them to grind her down in ways that were each individually deniable, but collectively devastating. She was fighting a war on 6 fronts simultaneously, and she was fighting it alone. She was 3 weeks in when Jack Callahan walked through her door. She almost didn't notice him at first. She was elbow deep in a transmission rebuild, focused trying to ignore the fact that two customers had called that morning to say they had seen the article online and wanted to know if it was true. She had heard footsteps and assumed it was Frank. But Frank's steps were lighter. These footsteps were slower, more deliberate. The footsteps of a man who had been walking a long time and had learned to take the ground seriously. She wiped her hands and turned around. He was standing just inside the garage entrance. Not the way Victor Hayes had stood, not in the center, not like he owned the place. He was standing near the door, hands loose at his sides, looking at the space with an expression that was hard to read. It wasn't sympathy exactly. It was something more like recognition. He was older, mid-60s maybe, silver hair cut close gray beard that had been growing for a while without being neglected. He wore a worn black leather vest over a dark shirt, and the vest had patches on it that she didn't immediately look at closely. What she noticed first was his eyes, clear and dark and attentive in the way of someone who had learned to pay attention because the cost of not paying attention had once been too high. "Morning," he said. His voice was even and unhurried. "Morning," she said. "Can I help you?" "Probably." He looked at her and then at the transmission turned on the workbench. "I've got a 72 Harley shovelhead that needs some attention. Heard this was the place to bring something that matters." She tilted her head slightly. "Who told you that?" "Word gets around," he said. "You're Robert Carter's daughter." She straightened. "You knew my father." "Knew him," he said. "Long time ago. He did some work for me when I was passing through. I was having troubles with my bike and 3 other shops had turned me away." He paused. "He didn't." She looked at him for a moment. "What's your name?" she said. "Jack," he said. "Jack Callahan." She nodded slowly. She gestured at the bay beside her. "Bring the bike by tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll take a look." He nodded. He started to turn, then stopped. He looked at the garage, at the replaced windows still fresh, at the new scratches in the concrete floor that hadn't been there before that no amount of cleaning could quite remove. "Rough stretch," he said. She kept her voice neutral. "We're managing." He looked at her with those clear dark eyes. "Your father used to say the same thing he said. Right before he fixed a problem most people thought was too far gone. He left." She turned back to the transmission, but she stood there for a moment without working, because something in the way Jack Callahan had looked at the garage, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with the expression of a man who was cataloging information he intended to use, had unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite name. She didn't know yet what that expression meant. She would figure it out soon enough. Jack came back the next morning with the Harley as promised. The bike was in remarkable shape for its age, which told her immediately that he cared about it the way her father had cared about the Camaro. Not because it was valuable, but because it was his and it deserved to be taken seriously. She diagnosed the problem quickly. A carburetor issue compounded by some ignition timing wear. Not critical, but the kind of thing that would become critical if ignored. 2 days, she told him, maybe less. "No rush," he said. He settled into the chair near the entrance, not in her way, not demanding anything, and picked up a magazine from the stack she kept there. She went back to work. By noon, she had almost forgotten he was there, which was unusual because she typically had a strong awareness of people in her space. But Jack Callahan had a quality of stillness that made him easy to stop registering. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He didn't use his phone constantly. He just sat there reading, occasionally glancing around the garage with that same cataloging expression. Around 1 o'clock, Frank came in with coffee and stopped short when he saw Jack. The two men looked at each other. Something passed between them that Madison didn't quite catch. "Jack," Frank said. His voice was careful. "Frank," Jack said. Same tone. Madison looked between them. "You two know each other." Frank set the coffee down. "From around," he said, which was the kind of answer that wasn't an answer. She looked at Jack. He was looking at the magazine again. She filed it away. The carburetor work was done by the next afternoon. Jack came back, paid her what she asked without negotiating, and started his bike. He listened to the engine for 30 seconds with the focused attention of someone who spoke the language. Then he turned it off and looked at her. "Good work," he said, not in the way people said it when they were being polite, in the way someone said it when they meant it specifically. "Thanks," she said. He didn't leave. He looked at the garage again, then at her. "You're under pressure," he said, not a question. She considered deflecting, but something about the directness of it made deflection feel dishonest. Yes, she said. Victor Hayes, he said. She went still. How do you know that name? Small town, he said. And not the first time that name's come up in conversation with people who shouldn't have had to hear it. She watched him carefully. What does that mean? She said. He met her eyes. It means I've been in Silver Creek for 3 weeks, he said, and I've been listening. A silence stretched between them. Why, she said. He looked at the garage sign, the one her father had painted with the slightly uneven letters. Because your father helped me once when I needed it, he said, and some debts take a long time to find the right moment to pay. She stared at him. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know what any of it meant yet. But standing in her father's garage in the middle of the worst 3 weeks of her professional life, something about Jack Callahan's steady certainty felt like the first solid thing she had stood on in a very long time. I don't need someone to fight my battles for me, she said. I know, he said. Robert didn't raise someone who did. He put on his jacket. I'll be back next week, he said. Bike'll need another look. He walked out. She stood in the middle of the garage in the afternoon light and felt the silence settle around her. Outside, the Harley started up. The sound of it was deep and steady and unhurried. Then it faded, and Madison Carter turned back to the work, because that was what she knew how to do. And because somewhere at the very back of her mind, below all the exhaustion and the fear and the math that wasn't adding up, something had shifted, just slightly, like the first sound of an engine turning over after a long time in the cold. Not running yet, but close. Jack came back on a Tuesday. Madison was on the phone with her insurance adjuster when she heard the Harley pull up. She recognized the sound immediately, that particular deep, unhurried rumble